Welcome, guys, back to the Grateful Living podcast. Today, I'm thankful to have Ariana Alejandra Gibson with me. Ariana is the founder and CEO of STIGMA, an app and website looking to create safe spaces for people to talk about their mental health with people who share their lived experiences. They do this through video storytelling and being able to ask for and offer messages of hope. Ariana, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm happy to be talking to you.
Of course. Thankful to have you on. So, for people that don't know you as well, can you take us back to the beginning, where you grew up, your family situation, what type of kid you were, things like that?
Yeah, so I was born in Costa Rica in a town called Escazú to a father who would be diagnosed about a year later with schizophrenia. My parents separated and my mom moved to the US and moved us to a town called Prairie Village that isn't as small as it sounds in Kansas City. And I mostly grew up in the Midwest, but would go every couple of years to visit my dad and family there in Costa Rica. So my dad and his side of the family all lived there, and we would go and stay for a few weeks. And I always sort of credit my passion for travel with being able to be exposed to multiple cultures from a very young age. I also, as we get into the conversation about mental health and schizophrenia and things like that, and in some ways, I think every young person that doesn't have both parents around probably craves that on some level. But there were moments and there are times when I've been an adult where I've reflected and thought that some of the harder phases of navigating severe mental illness for him and for the family, being exposed to that as a very young child would have had certainly had an impact. And I think I mostly got to have these contained moments, which I would have wanted more of if I could change it. But the contained moments where I was able to really spend some joyous times exploring the country where I was born and making adventures out of it and not having it be sort of every day, which was kind of nice.
Yeah. So you talked about it a little bit, but, especially given our focus, I'm curious, as you look at your life in hindsight, your dad dealing with schizophrenia, how did that affect you, maybe as a child and into your young adult life?
I think if you ask me as a young person, I would say in a bad way. And that's because there's the component, like I said, just of sort of parental presence and not having a father figure around and missing that when there were father-daughter dinners and things where I was not ever going to have someone to go with me for those things. Or it would be an uncle or my grandpa would fly in town. So I think that there's a component of just that missing him component. And then knowing that if I ever talked about him, people were afraid. And they wouldn't say that they were afraid, but you could see in people's eyes the way that they look at you when you say something like that. And I've often said, especially since I've started STIGMA and sort of talk more about the problem, that I'm a firm believer that people make their opinions in this life based on the personal lived experience that they have and the stories that they consume. And there is a fabulous author named Chimamanda Adichie who has a really famous TED Talk that's called The Danger of a Single Story. And I point to that a lot because what she calls out is that the way a story is told, by whom it is told, and the number of times it is told really influences, there's a lot of power in that and has a lot of power to influence the way people think about things. And so I often point out that if you wanted to understand schizophrenia, when I was born in the 80s, and so at that time or in the 90s, if you wanted to hear about schizophrenia or if it came across your path, no one really probably sought it out if they didn't have to, but if it came across your path, it was in one of two ways. It was a character on Law and Order or a murderer on the evening news. And that was really it. And so when you hear people, or when you think about people having this reaction when they hear the word schizophrenia, that's like, oh, and what they're doing is drawing an association, which is just totally human nature. But all of that very much served as an inspiration for the company that I've built today. But as a young person, it was really painful. It was painful to have a thing that I couldn't control, that I knew I was being judged for, that sometimes I was quite explicitly and like verbally sort of judged for, something that I couldn't control, and also something that caused me pain because I didn't want my dad to be sick, and he didn't want to be sick, and he didn't ask for it. And his family that loves and supports him in Costa Rica didn't want it either. And so it's this thing that causes a lot of pain that people make you feel bad for. And it was a feeling that I definitely spent some time trying to escape. I always wanted to help people when I was younger. So I was certain I was going to be a pediatrician, and I went to Boston College, and I started out pre-med very quickly learned that I was not good enough at it. And I also didn't love it. What I did love, though, was writing and storytelling and photography. And sorry, I'm in Chicago, so sirens are passing by. I hope they're not too loud.
You're good.
So I realized that storytelling thing was something I really loved. And I just decided to switch, like out of nowhere, went from being a biology major pre-med student to studying film. And my senior thesis was a documentary where I interviewed a family that I knew in Kansas City whose 19-year-old son had been diagnosed with schizophrenia. And I actually interviewed him, his older sister, his older brother, and both of his parents. Because what I knew from personal experience was that serious mental illness does not just affect the person who is navigating it. It affects all of the people who love that person and who start to see signs and are wondering what's going on with this person they love, and maybe having to encourage that person to seek some kind of treatment or support. And so I coupled those interviews with an interview with a doctor from the National Institute of Mental Health, who was a lead researcher on schizophrenia, to kind of help people understand. And what's kind of fascinating is I did that when I was 21, and here I am all of these years later doing it, a lot at volume. And so it's really this idea of contributing stories. But the question I know was about how it affected me then and now, but I can look at it now and say, because it was adversity that I went through, and because it built in me a very, very deep sense of compassion for people who are navigating something that other people don't understand, I wouldn't be where I am today if that weren't the case. And I really love my dad. So, I have to say that on the whole, I'm grateful for the experience.
Yeah. And maybe you answered this, but just like pushing a little bit more, but like, say there is someone out there that's listening to this that's growing up with a parent with schizophrenia. Is there anything that you would have done different, or is there any perspective you wish you had at a certain age?
I don't know if I would have done something different. Like, nothing comes to mind immediately, but something I would say to them is something that I learned from interviewing people. And one woman specifically, a woman named Jenny, I remember, was a trauma therapist. And she was one of the first people to really articulate well this idea that people's behavior doesn't have anything to do with you. And so in, psychology, they'll talk about presenting behavior. So if someone feels triggered by, someone living maybe with complex PTSD, or PTSD feels triggered by something that you don't understand, because it wouldn't be a trigger for you, but it was for them. And suddenly they're abrasive, or they leave a dinner party, or there's some behavior that just seems hard to understand. I think when it comes to mental health in general, when it comes to human beings, you have to think about the fact that the way someone is behaving is almost all of the time not about you. It's actually about them and what's going on inside them. And I think that sometimes human beings are prone to let the behavior of others be a reflection of them, or they internalize it. And I think I did a lot of that when I was younger. There are things you cannot explain when it comes to some of the behaviors I saw, and some of the maybe things that were said that were not intentionally meant to be mean to me, but that hurt a lot. And so as a young person, loved ones and his sisters and my family would say, don't be mad at your father. Like he can't help it. And that's not what he means. But when you're little, you just have these like sort of basic desires of, but I want the dad that I saw in the movie or the show or whatever it was. And so you're comparing against something that it could never be. But you're also sometimes using it as a sort of a reflection of your self-worth, which is sad to think about because it's not real. But I think that for anyone who's navigating having a parent whose behavior is hard to understand, what you need to know is it's not about you. And also that like love is such a powerful antidote to pain, that showing that person love, even when things are hard, showing someone love is never going to bring out anything but good things. And so I think that is a hard skill to learn in a moment where you're feeling pain, but probably the earlier that you learn it, the better.
Yeah. Also curious, in terms of like the divorce, you being in Kansas and your dad being in Costa Rica, as you look back at that, if someone else is in a similar situation where the other parent is not, across town or something like that, is there any piece of advice or, thing you can say to them in terms of making the journey a little easier?
I think it's technology makes it so different. So I'll give you this sort of just memory. When we were younger, when we first got to the States, we were on like food stamps and free government lunch when we got to public school. So I guess it was a while that we were struggling financially a bit. And long distance phone calls were really expensive. So there was not Wi-Fi. You couldn't call on WhatsApp, although that's what we use now. And so we had to be really sort of judicious about when we called Costa Rica, it was an event, and we tried to talk to everyone on the phone in their house and in our house. And so it made regular communication harder. And so it made the distance even greater. And even then, when my dad would send letters, there used to be like international mail was a white envelope and it had red and blue diagonal lines all around the edges. So you would get, packet or like letters in the mail, but if it had those lines around it, that border of blue and red, you knew it was an international letter. And I remember feeling excited when I would see one, knowing like, this is from my family in Costa Rica. And we didn't always get to hear what was in the letter, because sometimes what was in the letter was not appropriate for a child. And so I remember the disappointment of those moments. And so I think it's so much harder to imagine now someone who is a geographic distance that's, even larger than the one we had, but you have technology to connect you in that way. And I think that although there might have been more exposure to some conversations that would be harder to understand or, potentially traumatic in the worst case, I think I would, if I were a young person now, I would have been messaging and FaceTiming and sort of sending memes or whatever it might be in the way that I can communicate with my dad now if I want to, mostly through WhatsApp. But I think that's the encouragement I would give, is to have that communication often, because it is a way to feel close to people. It's sort of second best, maybe video calls are second best to getting to be in person, but also just kind of getting to share day-to-day stuff is another way to stay connected on, it's not this big event where you have to catch up. You can really just be like, here's what I'm looking at and doing today.
Yeah. So you talked about BC. Do you want to just talk about how you ended up there? What was the process like and why you chose BC?
Yeah, I actually sent a text message to my friend this weekend about this, thanking her for helping change the trajectory of my life in a way. So my sister and I growing up were 17 months apart. She's 17 months older, and we love each other desperately. And we also are super competitive. And I think in some ways that was really good. And so she will be okay with me saying this. She did better in school and I did better in sports, but I did really well in school. Desi was just I will only get straight A's and A pluses. She got an A- in pottery once and was very upset about it. I remember that very vividly. I was a little bit on the lazier side, procrastinator. And I was like, I can kind of phone this in and I can get A's and this is great. And sometimes I'll get a B plus. So that was kind of my vibe as a young person. But I remember when my sister applied to school, she applied early acceptance at some places and she ended up getting into every college she applied to. And she went to Yale. And so when you're following that, you're like, I better do really, really well. And so I did not get into every college I applied to, but I narrowed it down to Cornell, Northwestern, and Boston College. And Boston College had been a school that I applied to because my college counselor was like, I think it could be something you like, and they have a common application. So just fill it out and, do it. And I was like, oh, okay. And so I hadn't visited any schools ever. We couldn't afford really to do the trips. And so once I got in, then it was like, okay, now we can go see which one you like best. And so I went to Admitted Students Weekend. And the first one I went to was Northwestern. And I had gone to family reunions in Arlington Heights. And so I kind of knew the area. And I thought, this is probably what I'll pick, but I'm not sure because it was somewhat familiar. And I just liked the idea of it. And I went and visited, and I had a good visit, but not a great visit. And there are some reasons why I could explain or not. If you're curious, I can answer, but I'll move on for now. Yeah. That trip I did on my own. The next trip I went with my friend Bree, who I had known so when I was younger, I skipped second grade. And so when I got to third grade, I didn't really have a lot of friends, but there were these two girls who became my friends that year. And I am still friends with them to this day. This is the one that I texted over the weekend, one of them, Bree. Bree comes with me. We go to Cornell first, and we get there, and it was not a great time, and it was just not the right fit, and it was really remote, and it was so cold, and they were showing the bridge where bad things happen, and they were like, the snow that fell in November is the same snow you see on the ground today, and it was May, and I was like, I don't think I can do this, even though it's a beautiful campus and a great academic institution. So next was Boston College. So we ended up leaving Cornell early, went to Boston College, and it was the most sort of like quintessential Boston College experience. It was the free concert was while we were there. So we got to see Outkast, and we were like 2 rows away, and it just felt like this, very cool exposure. We went to, I believe, a BC hockey game. We went to, I can't remember, in Cambridge, where there's like, is it Harvard Square? I don't remember. It's been a long time, but we just like saw different parts of the city, and we met interesting people. And I loved that they didn't have a Greek system, and that people bonded over shared experiences like ski and snowboard club, or like I did for Boston. And so it felt amazing. And I remember kind of getting to the point of making a decision and thinking, well, I should probably go to Northwestern, because my sister went to Yale. And if people ask, where did your sister go? And then when you follow up with the answer, and I was about to it wasn't super close and like ready to sign, but I was really, really considering picking Northwestern just kind of for the name, even though I had visited these 2 places, and one of them like spoke to my heart, and I felt at home, and it felt exciting, and it really felt more right. And my friend Bree was like, what? And kind of talked me through it. And that's what I texted her over the weekend. I was like, I think about this all the time. And I've actually told this story a number of times, but I don't know if I've ever told you. So it was a nice moment that I got to share that with her. But I am probably more grateful for choosing Boston College than I am for, it's on the top 5 maybe lists of things that I'm grateful that I made the choice for. One, because I made a choice about what was good for me and not what the optics were or what would look good. And I don't know who this audience was that I was imagining that would care about this, but I was just, thinking about it like for whatever reason. But the friends that I made while I was there are some of my closest friends in the world. And one of them, Lauren, I can talk about, was a big inspiration with STIGMA and that experience. But we have a group of 13 women who met on, Newton campus, Hardy 3rd floor.
Yeah.
And we were all on the same floor, and some of us in different rooms. And I was lucky because Lauren was my random selection roommate. We stayed together. But the friendships I made and the support network that these women have been, all of us have been for each other through all of the life events that you just don't want to imagine, has been so meaningful. And I hope that everyone gets that, that college experience. And then when it came to starting STIGMA, 2 of the people that I talked to earliest on were Joe Roos and Eric Newman. And both of them were like, I like what you're doing. And they were classmates of mine and friends that we, hung out when we were in college all of the years. Joe is an investor now. Eric let me know about SSC Venture Partners. So Peter Bell is an investor through them. And I know he was on the show. That's why I mentioned it. But so there's this beautiful connection to Boston College. And then even people here in Chicago, like Kevin Willer, who is actually an LP in Long Jump, one of my investors, and an LP in SSC Venture Partners. So there's this beautiful way that I think Boston College really supports the people who are part of the community. And I hope every college has that. And I know a lot of them do, but I think BC has something really special.
Yeah. It's interesting. And I'm sorry, I keep feel like I'm only focusing on the hardships and the negatives, but just for the value towards the audience, you talked about growing up on food stamps. BC's student population, is decently well off. Mm-hmm. And I'm curious, for people that come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, self-esteem wise, that can be an adjustment, if someone's saying, oh, let's get dinner out in the city, in Boston. And it's like, do I have $30 to spend, every weekend like that? I'm curious, especially given what you've just said about how much you love it. Was that an adjustment at all in terms of the socioeconomics of that, and any advice to someone in a similar position?
I have a lot I can say on this. So no, it was not culture shock, because that culture shock started at 11. When I was 11, there was a college private school in Kansas City called Pembroke Hill, and they had a scholarship for multicultural people. Being born in Costa Rica, we were U.S. citizens because my mom was U.S. citizen, but being born in Costa Rica, we qualified, and they had a variety of scholarships. And, my sister and I had done well in school. And so my mom said, well, just apply and you don't have to go if you don't want to. And I was really happy where I was. I had a good friend group. I've always been pretty extroverted. So I had a social group group that I liked. And I think I had a cute boyfriend in 6th grade or whatever the deal was, right? Like I was like good at soccer and I like had my identity. And we ended up getting scholarships to Pembroke. And my mom said, oh, okay, well, you're going to go. And I said, no, you said I just had to take the test. She's like, I know, but you have to go. And I remember really fighting her on it. And then when I got to Pembroke, my first year, I was bullied pretty, I don't want to say ruthlessly, but it wasn't great. It was like, invite me to a party so that everyone doesn't talk to me and I'm there stuck with no ride home. Just stuff where like, if I told you the details, I would cry right now because it just, for whatever reason, those things like can really stick with you. And so fortunately things got better. But while I was at Pembroke, I started working when I was 11 years old. For a neighbor who had this like small business and it was under the table. And I think I made like $5 an hour, which was a tremendous amount of money. But I was a person who in high school and my sister as well, like we worked because if we wanted, the cute jeans that the kids at our school who were getting, BMWs on their 16th birthday, they were wearing it. So you want to compete. So at a pretty young age, I lived in a world of, not to oversimplify it, but sort of like haves and have-nots. And there were other scholarship kids too, but for the most part, it was a different kind of world. And what I will say is that with those challenges came exposure. And so I love people who work in like social impact work and sort of racial justice, and especially working with youth, they will often say you can't be what you can't see. And it's true. If you've never seen something, there's a lot that's sort of connected to that in stigma, but more on that later. But this idea that at a very young age, I got to see sort of what was possible in terms of the travel people did and the things that they talked about, or even just like the way a really nice house looks on the inside. Like you don't know what those things are when you haven't been in it, but it was hard to work so much and to work, at the grocery store. And sometimes people would come into that grocery store, or I lifeguarded at country clubs that people belonged to. But I still enjoyed it. And I think that there's a component of it. It's just like who I am. But I also think it's like, to your question earlier about like the advice you can give to young people, just be who you are. And I think that you're happier in life when you focus on what you have, not what you don't have. And that doesn't mean you're not allowed to feel like, man, I wish I had that. I wish I didn't have to work. But I got exposure to that really young. And so we got scholarships to middle school, high school, and then I got scholarship and financial aid to BC. Otherwise, I never could have gone. But when I got there, I didn't have any fear of that because I had been raised in it. But I will say that I had to quickly find a job because I had to figure out how I was going to pay for food and different things. I think I had help with, at the on-campus housing and stuff like that. But I think books, even my grandpa might have helped a little bit with that. I wish I remembered, but I don't. But I worked 30 hours a week and went to school. And so I think about it now and I'm like, I almost didn't process that most of my friends just went to class. Just went to class. And so I worked at Rogi's, which doesn't exist anymore, but it was like a bar and restaurant. And I served, I joke sometimes that I served 10-cent wings and dollar drafts to my classmates. But I also met a lot of people that way. And so it was funny when people would be like, hey, Ariana, do you want to come to this party? And my friends would be like, how do you know that senior? And I'm like, oh, I served them beer the other day. So I think that, there's a silver lining to everything. And it didn't feel bad at BC for me. And I think that the way that I learned to not define myself by how much money I make has been the reason why I've gotten to do some really incredible things in life, because I'm not, I don't have a lot to lose financially. I can launch a startup and feel really excited about it and do something that I think is going to make the world better, because I'm not so focused on sort of where I stack up financially to others.
Yeah. You talked about it a little bit, but, obviously pre-med to film and history, that's a bit of a change. If you can go back to that time period, right? Because there's going to be a college kid listening to this, making that change, and maybe the parents aren't supportive or something like that. In that moment, how tough was that? And maybe, what gave you the confidence at that time to make such a big decision in your life?
I think a big part of it is when you get yourself to where you are, a lot of other people don't have a say. So if my parents had paid for my school, they might have said, we paid for this and we're not going to keep paying for it if. I don't have that type of mom, but I think parents can do that. And sometimes they're really doing it for like their child to do well, or, they have good intentions, I should say. But when you got yourself to where you are, you get to make the choices. And I think that's, a lesson that every person could learn overall. Like, if you make sure that you put yourself in a good position yourself and that you didn't rely on someone else if you didn't have to. I'm not saying never rely on anyone, but the more you can build the life you want for yourself, the less anyone can tell you that it's not what you should be doing. And so for me, I had worked really hard to get there, and I wasn't going to lose my scholarship because I changed my major. And for me, what it really boiled down to was I sat in an organic chemistry class, and I remember thinking, I have like a decade more of this. If this is what I pick, that's what's going to happen. Yeah. And another big piece was I was also in the honors program at BC. And so being in the honors program and being pre-med meant that you could not study abroad. And I didn't realize that when I signed up for it. And it was because the number of classes you had to take to complete both programs, there wasn't time for you to go abroad for any period of time. Yeah. And I knew I was going to go abroad because it was like included in my tuition and I would be able to do that. And I had always wanted to live abroad. I always joke that I have like more Costa Rican blood than American blood because I'm just happy when it's humid and I'm warm, and I live in Chicago and went to school in Boston, so I don't know what I'm doing. But I wanted to enjoy my life, and I wasn't enjoying the classes, and I thought I could spend a decade of my life doing things I don't enjoy. And the reason I'm doing it is to help people, and there are other ways to help people. And part of the reason I'm doing it is the security of knowing that if I complete steps 1 through 250, I will get to the end of this and I will be a doctor. And I don't think that's as certain as I thought it was at that time, but I knew I was giving up a level of security and some prestige that I think I wanted. I think when you are felt to me, when you're made to feel less than, which did happen occasionally in high school and college, only by really insecure people who honestly like don't have a lot going on, that they make a young person feel bad for not having a lot of money. But you do have it in you. You do have a bit of a chip on your shoulder that you're like, I want to prove something. And I knew I was smart and I knew I was hardworking. And I think that felt like a sure thing. But I leaned into this idea of, do you want your life to look like this for 10 years? And the answer was no. And I also could look at it and say, I'm usually pretty naturally good at a lot of academic things I try. And I'm not with this. I have to work really hard to be average. And so that has to be a signal. So I remember I actually flipped through a course book that had like all of the majors in the School of Arts and Sciences that I was in. And I was flipping through the pages and I saw film and I was like, well, that's interesting, because I had been a writer and I had been a photographer. And in my mind, I thought, well, that's kind of just combining two mediums that I really love, like storytelling and writing and visual arts, but I'll learn about like video. This will be great. And I went to my intro to film class, and I remember it was like in a basement and taught by a not super charismatic priest. And I loved it. I was like, oh, this just like excites me. And by the time I got to my senior year, I remember my roommates being like, I can't even watch a movie with you anymore, because I'd be like, do you see that sound design? That was recorded in a studio. Can you hear it? And I was just so excited to show off my like new talent. Yeah. But it was the right call. And I felt really alive in the classes, and I felt really alive in the work. And even in the work I do today, the thing I get most excited about is the storytelling and the filmmaking and the, capturing people and then showing them back to themselves and getting to have them say or feel really proud. And I've had so many people say like, I can't believe that's me. And when you get to give that feeling to someone, it's just this very, very beautiful experience.
Yeah. Obviously it's hard to summarize 15 years quickly, but I mean, maybe do you want to give us some level of understanding of what you did post BC and prior to STIGMA App?
Yeah. So it's hard to find a job in film, shocking. And so I actually got a job at a company that has really grown since I worked for them. My first job out of college was with ID Tech Camps, which is a technology camp for kids that is at this point, I mean, it was nationwide then, but like really, really nationwide now. And they partner with colleges and universities, and they let young people sort of come on campus, and they get to be in a computer lab all summer. And they had a film course, and I ended up applying for that and then getting picked to teach this course to younger kids, where it was Photoshop, basic video game design, and like video or filmmaking. And I remember being like, I do not know how to make video games. And they're like, oh, it's really basic. You're teaching 7-year-olds, so like you can learn it in a week. And so I did, and that was great. And from there, that got me to Austin. And I actually thought I really wanted to live in Austin because my grandpa lived there, and I had visited a couple of times, and it just seemed like a really fun place to go. And again, I wanted to be warm. 4 years in Boston, I was out, I was ready. I went from graduation at BC, where it was, I think, 45 degrees and sleeting, to literally days later being on campus at UT Austin, and it was 107. And I was like, I don't know how to process this temperature change. But I stayed there for 2.5 years, and I ended up working at GSD&M at an ad agency there. I think that was a fantastic job for a creative. So I started out as a creative project manager. And what I learned in that role was how to be more organized than I naturally am, but also how creative work gets done in a business setting. And I had to talk to every player on every side of something. So from the moment a client said that they wanted something, and the client I worked on was AT&T, to the billboard that I could see, or the TV commercial, or whatever it was. And so seeing all of the hands that had to touch something for a great piece of creative work to get out the door was really, really interesting. I left there to work for a startup, which was the nation's first text message based dating TV show. So there was it was a green screen and a host, and we would use the news station, and we were live 7 nights a week from 2 a.m. to 4 a.m. And I directed the live show at like 22. Maybe I was 23, but I think I was 22. So it was super early, and they were like, you're cheap. We would love to work with you. And I was like, I love film. And I just worked way too, like 80 hours a week. It was way too much, but got good experience there. And then fast forwarding, I ended up leaving Austin to go to New York City because I'd always wanted to live there. And I just wanted to kind of see what that was like. But the job I had there, I didn't totally love. And I was thinking, okay, I'm going to go back to Austin. And my sister was living in Chicago, and she was launching her first startup. And she was like, well, just come here for a year. We haven't lived in the same city for so long. And I was like, all right, 1 year. And now I've been here for 14 years, which is shocking. But I would say, to kind of like truncate that whole experience, marketing was sort of an easy place to go because I had worked in advertising and I understood things like that. I also was a graphic designer and video editor and could camera op and just like do things related to like my creative side. And so I really found a home in brand work. So it kind of started with business development, but then creating the assets for like, okay, what is it that we're going to share with people and assets we needed for marketing? And so brand is really such a beautiful way to tell stories for companies, and it can be about the company itself, and it can be about the products that they make. So I ended up doing work for companies like Dell had a new document storage solution. I had to make people really care about it. Or Deloitte wanted to go after the biggest line of business that they had ever gone after, and they needed to tell a story about it. And I got to a point where I was really doing well with the storytelling piece, where like Deloitte would fly me to New York, and I thought that was just the coolest thing, that they would fly me out and I would be in 30 Rock and I'd be there for a week, just like hustling and getting creative work done for this consulting firm. And so I think that really helped me build my confidence around my ability to tell a story and tell a visual story. And I was also doing work that was getting on like commercial, like broadcast TV commercials. And so I started to really believe in myself as a director, which took a long time. To call myself a director took me years of doing the work before I thought I could. And part of it was because it was corporate, part of it because it wasn't the directors I studied in film school. Yeah. But I think I kind of finally got there, which was so exciting. And at a certain point was consulting, kind of just doing different types of work like that for companies, and then joined a tech startup in Chicago because I was consulting, and they said, please join us. And they offered me the opportunity to build a brand from scratch. So it was pre-product, pre-launch. And they said, build it, create it, manage the creative services team. I managed a lot of the marketing functions and even like comms and PR by the time that I left that company. So it was really this like kind of organic way of getting there, but I wasn't able to just leave school and go try and make it in New York or LA. I didn't have the option, and most people don't, to say like, I want to go be an artist and I'm going to make money right away. And so I think it was a longer path for me to get to kind of getting to do the dream job that I get to do now. And I had to make it for myself. Like I get to do my dream job, but I created it. And that's a very cool feeling too.
Yeah. Oh, it's awesome. So, within this time period, during our pre-call, you talked about 2008. I think you had your first panic attack, and just like, I think you live with generalized anxiety disorder. I guess I'm curious, um, how did you end up, for people that aren't, knowledgeable in mental health, they might not recognize, their first panic attack, right? And, what got you to steps of like either learning from, a professional or figuring out, that you do live with generalized anxiety disorder?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked this question. We ask people this a lot at STIGMA, and I am part of the statistics. So there is a lot of data that shows that the average amount of time between first experiencing a symptom of mental illness or struggling with your mental health and first seeking treatment is 11 years. And sometimes it's 12 and it can be up to 15 with different studies, but the average is 11 years. And I think so much of that has to do with a lack of exposure and a lack of education around what these things are. But for me, to the memory that you pointed out, I knew what schizophrenia looked like because it was in my world, but no one at home in high school was talking about mental health very much. It just wasn't a topic of conversation. And for me, I remember being a very young child and crying when I had to go to bed. And my mom would say to me, "Why are you crying?" And I would say, "Because I'm scared." And she would say, "What are you scared of?" And I couldn't tell her. And I remember when I said, "I don't know," and she had no answer, it almost felt more scary. I was like, "Oh, well, she's the grown-up and she's supposed to have all of the answers and she doesn't know either." And I can look back at that now and go, those were certainly my first symptoms of anxiety, this feeling of, fear and fear of the unknown and maybe panic. And, I can't step into my body then, but the memory of that fear at night is very real.
Yeah.
And so I didn't regularly live with that. Like I said, I'm an extroverted person. I didn't have, issues with social anxiety or things that were like really complicated where it would have warranted me like seeking treatment or help. But I probably navigated anxiety. Like I had stomach aches all the time when I was in middle school. And I was like, oh, my stomach just hurts. And they say that in children often, struggling with your mental health. And it doesn't mean that you have a disorder that must be diagnosed, but you can have anxiety and not have diagnosed anxiety disorder. And I think a lot of people don't understand that. But they say for children, if children are going to the nurse a lot, if they have a tummy ache a lot, if they have a headache a lot, there are certain cues for children where they haven't learned the vocabulary yet to express what it is that they're feeling. And so it can manifest in these more physical symptoms. And so I look at middle school when I was bullied, that was the time that I had stomach aches constantly. But so I was in my 20s before I had my first panic attack. And I was at my 25th birthday party and my aunts from Costa Rica were in town. This was in Chicago, and I was with a group of friends and family, and it was happy. And I think the thing that happens for people outside of the experience of panic attacks is often they're like, well, what are you nervous about? And the hard thing, if you're someone who goes through panic attacks and experiences them like I do, there's not always a source you can point to. Like, it's not that easy. You're not like, well, I failed this test, or, well, I got a really bad review at work and then I had a panic attack. It so often is sort of this like stirring that's probably happening. And then there's some moment where it expresses itself. And so I remember I was talking to someone I didn't know very well. And as I was talking to her, I started to have this like tunnel vision where everything went dark and it was just getting to this like very small area of light. And I remember my heart was racing and I felt like I couldn't breathe. And then I panicked thinking, what is this person thinking of what I must look like right now? That was the thing that took me a long time to learn, that like the panic I was feeling on the inside, that I was like, I must look very strange to anyone looking at me from the outside. It doesn't match up. And so, I remember times where I was with someone who I was close to where I said, like, I'm having a panic attack, and they're like, I can't tell. And that was helpful. I had some moments like that in therapy when I talked about some hard things that, kind of learning what it looked like on the outside was meaningful to me for whatever reason. But in that moment, I had never had a panic attack before. And so I had no idea what was happening. And I had lived in fear probably my whole life, from at least, tween age on, worrying that I would also be schizophrenic. And so I had read the data and the statistics, and it's more common in males than it is in females. And in males, it presents typically younger, from like 17 to 19. And in females, it can be 18 to 21. Like I had all these things memorized and known, and I was outside of that window, but I wasn't that far outside of that window. And I remember thinking to myself, is this it? Like, is this a psychotic break? Is this what that feels like? And imagine what my life would have been like, what that experience would have been like if people had talked about what panic attacks were, because then I would have better understood. I wouldn't have had to deal with this very crippling fear. And I love my father. And I think people with every version of mental health and illness and every range of that are beautiful. So this is not to discredit anyone with schizophrenia or my father, but it's more that this thing that I feared because I didn't fully understand it, I really thought was going to happen or was happening in that moment. And so I remember at some point the moment passed and I kind of moved on, but it was one of those things where I didn't go, well, I should go get that checked out. It was like, well, I'm going to hope that that never happens again, because ignorance is bliss. And if it doesn't, I don't have to deal with it. And that's not a healthy way to handle it. And that's what I don't want people to do. But I've thought about that moment a lot, because it was probably a few more years before, on our WhatsApp thread between all of the BC roommates, I said something about anxiety and learned that 8 out of the 14 women had panic attacks or were on anxiety medication, but we had just never talked about it before. And we were the closest of close friends, as close as you can get. Yeah. We talked about things that seemed way harder and more complicated. And I think that is because human beings are not in the habit of doing it. That's, why stigma exists, but also this is something we're going to have to teach people to do. And it's a hard thing. It's one of the hardest things to do, to talk about the stuff that makes us feel vulnerable, to ask for help, to say that we're struggling. I struggle with it to this day.
Yeah. Yeah. 2016, a really nice thing happens in your life. You and John get married. Talk about, I guess, how you felt comfortable with that. And, did you have conversations with him prior to getting married about mental health, or has that been sort of a journey, as you've grown in your knowledge of being able to speak about it?
Yes, for us, it was a requirement because John grew up in the sort of born into the projects of Philly and was orphaned at a pretty young age in the foster care system, I think in about 14 homes total, like with family and foster home placements included, and was horrifically abused. So when I met him, he had not talked about it a lot with anyone ever. And as he started to open up to me, I remember saying to him, you have to go talk to someone about this because it's important that you process it. And I have to go talk to someone about this because I don't know how to process it, because it was some pretty heavy trauma. And I wanted to honor his secrets and not share it with anyone. But I also, holding on to it, felt like I don't know how to carry something this heavy. Yeah. And I think that's a skill too, that you have to learn, like from the people that I've interviewed at Stigma who talk about how their loved ones can help them when they're in a moment of struggling. I think the key so often is like asking what would be helpful of that person in a moment when they're not struggling. And then when they are, having kind of an action plan. That was something I learned that I thought was really powerful, but I didn't know any of that. I just knew like, I want to be there for him, but I also don't know how to be there for him. So for us, mental health was always like a pretty open topic of conversation. And, I very much I had gone to therapy once in my 20s and had a very bad experience. And this is another thing I find a lot when I interview people, that one bad therapy experience, and that can be for a lot of reasons. It's not necessarily because it's a bad therapist. It can often be it's a bad fit. Sometimes there are therapists that aren't, the best, but it can also be that the patient isn't ready. Like there's so many parts to that equation, like any relationship. But when someone has a bad therapy experience, I think sometimes it's easy to say, well, that's what therapy is, and therapy didn't really work for me. And so I think that's an important topic to just kind of like cover and make sure that people know that if you don't like the first one, it might be that you could find someone you really do like. And sometimes it takes more than a couple to figure out who is a good fit for what you need and are looking for. But what I realized was I had this bad experience. So I was one of those people and I was like, oh, that's what therapy is? That's not for me. I don't enjoy that at all. That didn't feel helpful. And I think I gave it 3 sessions and then didn't go back. And then the catalyst for me going back to therapy was actually some of these conversations with John. And then I started getting into some of my own work. And I have been on and off, have seen the same therapist since that time. And I think there are seasons in my life where I need it more and need it less. But that's for me personally, how I use therapy. Everyone is different. Some people will always use therapy, just like they will always use a personal trainer when they go to the gym. And some people are like, I don't need the personal trainer. I know the exercises I want to do. I'm disciplined and I do them. And I love that analogy because I once met a man who said, tell me this. I have a friend who's been going to therapy for 15 years. And I say, if you've been going to therapy for 15 years, it's not working. And when that happened, I said, can I ask you a question, sir? Do you work out? And then I got into the analogy from there, but tried to help him understand that like mental health is work, just like physical health is work. You don't get to be physically healthy if you're not thoughtful about what you put into your body and thoughtful about the amount of activity you give it. And the same is true of your mind. Like it just works that way. And I think that's one of the harder parts for people to understand about mental health in general is that if you want it to be good, you're going to have to invest something into it.
Yeah. You referred to this earlier in the interview. May of 2020, unfortunately, you lost a friend of yours, Lauren. I'm curious, now it being a couple of years, is there something you've learned from the grief journey, that you would give as advice to someone that's, who's losing, a friend in their 20s or 30s, maybe recently?
No, but the reason why is I think grief is one of the most personal things there is in the world, kind of like love. And so how I grieve is not going to be the same as how anyone else grieves. I actually lost a friend in my 20s and my 30s. One of my very close friends in my 20s got meningitis. She was sick one day and gone the next. And it was devastating. And I love Brooke and still think about her constantly. And the way I grieved Brooke, someone who I lost without a moment's notice, without the ability to say goodbye, felt different and in some ways similar to Lauren, who got a rare and aggressive cancer, and we lost her in less than a year. So I think, the only thing I know about grief and can say is that you kind of have to just like lean into it. Like there are a bunch of analogies and they're not all helpful. So like I'll share one, but I don't know if it's helpful or not because it just doesn't always work for everyone. But they talk about grief being like you have this grief button inside of a box, and inside of the box is a giant red ball, like a rubber ball, softball, whatever it is, but it'll bounce. And in the beginning, the ball is so big, it's just expanding to fill the entire space. So when you first lose someone, all you feel is that button pressed down. That button is just constantly pressed. And then over time, they say that ball can get a little bit smaller, but it's always moving around. So that's why you get these moments where you're like, I'm fine for days. And then you get hit with a wave of grief that just takes you out for days. I think that, that analogy has sort of been one of the better ones for me to help me understand how unpredictable those swings can be. I think when you, when you're doing things that are going to remind you of the person, like I had the opportunity to go back to BC for the first time since Lauren died. And I was asked to come back and like teach a seminar to the entrepreneurship club. And it was just such an honor. It was such a cool full circle moment, such a like feeling of accomplishment and arrival in these different ways, and also nostalgic and hard. And I traveled with my creative partner who, was obviously like, we always have different hotel rooms, but like, I wouldn't have had my partner come with me. I wouldn't have had my sister come with me. I wouldn't have had a friend come with me to like stay in the room with me. I knew I was going to need to cry, and I also was going to need to perform. And for this, this class, and then I had a shoot while I was there, and we did a mental health pop-up with college students, and it was fantastic. But I needed to give myself the space to like bawl when I needed to like be on that campus and think about her and be in the moment doing these things and going, Lauren's rooting for me and I'm living this life that I promised her I was going to live. And then be able to go home and be a real human being and say, thinking about Lauren all day in the space where I spent so much time with her and was, had such fond memories of being there with her in a time in life that was so carefree. And you fast forward into your late 30s when you have all of the things that life can throw at you in the time between college and your late 30s. And it can't possibly be as carefree because you've lived a bigger life. You've lost and you've suffered in ways that you hadn't when you were young. And so it was processing some of that too. But I think for me, creating space to grieve has been really helpful. Not everyone can do this, but I couldn't with Brooke. But with Lauren, I asked her before she passed away, I said, I know you don't want to do this, but I really want a video because I'm like, I speak very much in video. Yeah. And I really want a video that I can watch when I miss you. Will you record something for me? And she said, yeah. And I didn't know when it would happen, but I know Lauren well enough to know that it was going to happen. It was never not going to get done. And one day she and her husband, on an email sent me this video, and I watch it a lot. And it is just one of the most valuable things that I have in the world. And I watch it sometimes when I'm sad, and I watch it sometimes when I'm happy, and sometimes when I just want to hear her voice. And I think that talking about her and letting myself get emotional is one of the ways that I honor her and I honor grief. So when I get to talk to college kids, and it's a fair amount, which is just the coolest thing in the world, because at one point I considered being a teacher too. I love getting to talk to young people. I always say there is room in business for tears. I've raised $575,000 crying in every pitch I've ever done. And you can ask anyone on my cap table, every single investor has seen me cry. And it's when I talk about Lauren. Yeah. Sometimes when I talk about my son, but I do that because it invites her into the experience with me. It invites her to join me in what I'm doing. And so I think with grief, everyone is going to be different, but the depth of your grief is usually a reflection of the depth of your love. And so when the moments get as hard and as dark as they can possibly get, if you can try and remind yourself of that in that moment and find a way, as impossible as it seems, to be grateful that you got to experience a friendship that deep and a love that deep. I think that's the only way to start climbing out of the hole. Because it can feel like a hole or a cave. You have to find a little bit of light. And sometimes the light is the gratitude for having gotten to have such a strong connection in your life.
Yeah. In 2020, you also became a mother. How has motherhood been, and how has been raising a son with autism?
Yeah. So River was born in 2018. And so, no, that's okay. But I only correct it because it sort of ties to Lauren and what that experience has been. I am just a big believer so I've interviewed a lot of people about sobriety and addiction. And a lot of people will say the opposite, and they've learned this in programs they've done, but the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's community. And what I know is that so often people who are dealing with substance use disorder and addiction are self-medicating because they are struggling with their mental health or in pain in some way. And so I think that where for them, the solution used to be some sort of substance, they find a path and a way towards the solution being people and community. And I share that because I remember when a doctor first suggested that we should get our son tested because he had a language delay, and he's in a dual language household. We speak Spanish and English in the home. And I said, but I've read that it can be that when there are two languages, that's why their language development is slower. And we went to we'd gone to a newer pediatrician for the 18-month appointment, and she was really blunt. And she was like, he does not have enough words, go get him tested. And in that moment, I called Lauren and I talked to her about it. And of course, John too, but she was just like a rock for me in that experience. And I think when we're navigating these things in life that we're scared about and that we feel vulnerable about, and that there are complex emotions associated with, because I have to be honest and say that my thought in that moment was, I hope he's not, which I feel guilty about now. I didn't know what I didn't know. And I feel bad that I felt that way, but I think it's also important for people who are, in my position and other life experiences to not pretend that we didn't have bad feelings, because shame thrives in secrecy and the dark. And I would be ashamed of that if I didn't talk about the fact that it was a terrible thing to think, because River is outstanding and fantastic. And I am so lucky to be his mom. And I tell him that every single night before bed. So his ego is going to be just fine. Self-confidence check. But I remember then we went and did the test. And I remember thinking as we did the test, like, I know what they're going to say. And I knew I wasn't going to get the results right away. And because it took I want to say 6 to 8 weeks or something like that. And Lauren really wasn't doing well. And so I remember being in the car with John, and I said, he was like, do you want to call Lauren or something? He kind of knew that she was my person to call in that moment. And I hadn't told any of our BC friends yet. I just wasn't ready. And because I didn't want to talk about it, because I didn't know how I felt about it. And I called Lauren, and I just bawled, and I told her the truth. And I said, it's because once I get this information, I don't know if you're going to be here, and I don't know if I can call you, and I don't know if I can do this without you. And I pray for everyone that they get to have a friendship that deep. Like, I often call Lauren my friendship soulmate, like someone who you can just be yourself with, and they accept every part of who you are and think that you're great. And we'll tell you that whenever you need to hear it. And Lauren died May 12th, 2020. And it was 6 weeks after that River got his diagnosis. And so it was just one of those experiences in life where I was already at a level of, I had never lived with depression. I had never gone through depression. I definitely had situational depression from this experience with Lauren, and anticipatory grief before she passed. But I just remember thinking, I have never had the feeling of, I don't know how I'm going to get out of bed. And I had that feeling. And now I had to get out of bed and be an autism mom. I had to guess what? His preschool doesn't take your insurance. So now you don't have a place for him to go get this therapy that he needs yesterday, because you better get on it right away. And I could do an entire podcast interview about how poorly treated parents of neurodivergent children are when it comes to marketing on Instagram and Facebook, and the way that they sort of guilt you into thinking that you're not buying enough things for your child, and that you're not thinking of enough things, even when you're reading all the books and doing all the stuff. But it was probably the most challenging time in my life, because I had to do this thing that was really hard. I didn't feel like I had the emotional reserves to do it. And someone who I had looked to, and she was not the only one, to be clear. My sister is fantastic. John was there. My mom was there were a lot of my friends, there were a lot of people, but this person who always knew what to say and always knew how to make me feel better wasn't there. And so I had to learn how to navigate that. And I had to learn how to forgive myself for feeling disappointment, because that's what I felt. And again, this is something I say because we have to talk about this stuff. I felt disappointed, and then I felt so much shame for feeling disappointed. And one of the things I've said a lot about parenting a child with autism, and this could go for a lot of things, I just know my experience of River and autism, is that I think every parent knows that at some point you're going to come to the realization that your child is not going to be a mini version of you. Just because you loved soccer, they might never play a sport. Just because you love to write, they might hate reading and writing. And I think so often, especially in earlier decades, generations ago, people were trying to make their children just this walking miniature version of them. Yeah. And what happens when your child is faced with developmental differences is that you instantly have to let that go. That dream and vision of the child that you imagined they would be is never going to be the child that they are. No matter if they are neurotypical, if they don't have developmental delays, no matter what it is, that will never, ever, ever, ever be true, because they are on their own path. And so I think I was struggling a fair bit. And I remember a woman who is friends with Kathy and Bree, my friends from growing up, who had gone to the public high school, and we had to separate for that, but they had their public school friends, and I met their friends. And so I knew them, but didn't know this woman that well. Her name's Lizzie. She sent me a message and said, hey, there's this mom that I know, and she's fantastic, and she's the best advocate for her son. And she, if you're interested, I can put you in touch. And I remember when the offer happened, and I've said this before too, but when people said, do you want to talk to this super mom? She does all the things and she knows all the stuff. Do you want to talk to her? I remember thinking, no, I do not. I just want to get the information she has in her brain to tell me. And I would describe it as I was at the bottom of this mountain, and there were nothing but thick, dark clouds and this treacherous terrain that I was afraid of and did not want to climb. And there was a force pushing me. I had no choice, because I didn't have a choice. I had to learn this stuff. And I remember thinking like, these are women who are further, and not that there are non-binary people and men and all different genders who are going through this too, but the people I was offered introductions to were female moms. And I remember thinking like, they're further up the mountain. I can't see them through the clouds. And someone's asking if I want to talk to them. And I just want them to hand me a map. Like I want them to reach through the clouds, hand me a map, so I have a little bit of an idea of what's coming. And I never responded because I wasn't there. And then I got a message out of nowhere on Instagram from a woman I didn't know. And she said, "Hey, I'm Lizzie's friend. Do not respond to this message. I don't want a response. I just want to tell you about this book." And the book was called Special by Melanie DeMitt. And it's a story of a really independent woman who was a journalist and traveling the world and couldn't wait to have kids. And then she had a child, or she got pregnant, and the pregnancy was perfect and nothing was wrong and everything was great. And she ended up having a child who was born with the most severe form of cerebral palsy you can have. And so her child won't ever speak and won't ever walk. And she suddenly was looking at a life that was so different from the life that she was living and the one she had imagined with her child. Yeah. And people had sent me like poems about going to Holland. And like, it's a very popular thing to send to people who have children with autism. And that's not to discredit the author or the friends of mine who sent it to me. I love them for doing it. But it didn't resonate. I was like, the analogy is like, you think you're going on a trip to Paris, but you end up going on a trip to Holland and you just have to appreciate the tulips. And it was just, you can see by the way I'm repeating it, for me, it didn't resonate.
Yep.
But here was this woman who was like, "Don't you dare write me back. Here's a book." And then I read that book, and the author talked about the things that were in my head. She talked about, I'm ashamed that I felt that way. And I'm ashamed that when people said my child is a gift, I didn't believe it. I thought that's just something people say because they're in something hard. And she just put to words and then published in a book some of the thoughts that I had that I thought made me a monster. And it was one of the most freeing things that happened in that process. And also it changed my perspective on everything. And it was because I wasn't being so hard on myself anymore. I had more emotional reserves to like do the things I needed to do. I didn't feel so alone for having the thoughts that I was having. And it came from a place of hearing from someone who had been through my exact situation, and not exact because of course the differences in our children are different, but someone who just made me feel less alone because they understood what it was like to have a child with a disability. And I built a company to help that happen for more people. And so I think, there's like the stuff with my father and like the stuff I navigated with John and the stuff that, he and I navigate with River, these hardships, these are the things that often, yes, build our character, but make us inspired to do the kinds of things and the type of work that people feel alive when they connect with. Like people feel, I'm so proud of STIGMA. I'm so proud of the brand that we built. Like, yes, I made a career on building brands, but we've built a brand that people want to be successful. Like people really don't want STIGMA to fail. And that's its own unique kind of pressure. But it's just something to be so proud of because it's tapping into what human beings need, which is a sense of connectedness to people who understand them.
Yeah. So let's start talking about STIGMA. I guess, in your words, I guess what are the benefits of the app for the user, and what does the app offer?
I think the biggest benefit is like a perfect segue. So well done, interviewer, to what we were just talking about, which is that I often say we don't go to like cocktail parties or dinner parties and people have a "hello, my name is" sticker that also lists like, I have anxiety disorder, I'm the parent of a child with disabilities, and I also live with panic attacks. But how nice it would be if that were the case. And it was at the STIGMA launch party. So we made it optional, but we said, you all have these lanyards and these name tags that are these huge plastic things. And here are stickers with different conditions and lived experiences, and take a blue one for something you've experienced and take a black one for something that someone you love has experienced. And before the end of the night, have a conversation with someone who shares the same sticker as you. So we wanted to create this like real life example of that. And I think that the biggest benefit of the app is that it helps people instantly find people who share their lived experience. Second to that is that it's very immediate support. So to be clear, STIGMA is not a replacement for treatment or therapy. It's actually a tool that can increase your readiness for treatment or therapy, or it can be used as a supplement. So we have many therapists who recommend us to their patients. We have entire practices that do it. We have individual therapists that do it, because what they understand is we have built it in such a way that it's not designed to ever be able to replace therapy. But we did have one member, and she is okay with me sharing this. And I always give that disclaimer, but I never share anything that people share with us unless they give me permission. She didn't ask for hope. I offered her hope. And then she sent me a thank you message, and it was a video. And I said, can I share this with everyone? Because this captures exactly what I think the benefit is of this. And she was like, yes, absolutely. She's someone who I know. And she was like, I want to help, whatever will help you. But one of the things she said, and I'll kind of paraphrase this, is my family and friends know what it is that I'm navigating. They understand that I have, this mental health struggles that I do have, but I don't feel like I can call them on a Tuesday morning as they're getting their kids ready for school and ask them to tell me and reassure me that I'm not a monster, because those feelings don't come at convenient times. They can come late at night. They can come early in the morning. And I think the hardest thing is when you have that feeling and then you have to go to work and you have to be on and you have to deliver the big pitch or take thoughtful notes or make sure that your plan for building the new product is thoughtful and you don't miss anything. And having to perform and deliver in that sort of professional way when you're struggling, when you feel like you can't talk to anyone about it, even if you're in therapy, and even if best case scenario, you can afford therapy once a week, that moment can happen the day after you had therapy or days away from when you would go. And so it's not, again, meant to replace what that therapy is, but it's meant to give you an outlet to say, this is a safe space. You can come here and you can find people who are only here to be kind. So we often describe STIGMA as a community committed to kindness, and we moderate every message. So it is not a public social media platform. It's not like a Facebook group where everyone has a profile and you can DM each other and there are likes and comments and upvotes. Like there's just no vanity. The idea behind it is you can go into our app and you can filter stories by lived experience and condition and identity categories. So if I want to see other people with anxiety or other people talking about panic attacks, I can filter by that and see all different kinds of people of different ages and races and genders and sexual identities and all of these different things to show me that, living proof I'm not alone, but also in these people's stories, I get to hear, how do they manage it? What are the tools in their toolkit? And so we came up with the tagline crowdsourcing hope for that reason, because that's really when you're struggling what you need. You need that light when you're in the cave. You need that little bit of hope. And so often it is a more powerful sort of version of that when it's someone who gets it, when it's someone who totally understands what it's like. So we allow people the opportunity to select their audience. So you can say, I'm doing this ask for hope because I had a panic attack and I only want other people with panic attacks to see this. So if you have had panic attacks and Joe has not, when you go into STIGMA app, you will see my ask for hope, but Joe won't. And so the idea overall is, how do we create safe spaces for people to practice talking about their mental health? Because that is required to get on the path to healing. So to kind of bring it full circle, I talked about that 11-year window. So many solutions that are fantastic solutions in the mental health space and in the mental health tech space are really focused on that moment once someone has raised their hand, once they've typed into Google therapists in my area. What we're focused on is identifying that 60 to 80% of people with treatable mental illness who don't seek treatment, helping them understand that it's okay to talk about, giving them access to language and vocabulary you can use to express how you're feeling, and then exposing them through our sponsored partnerships with different types of behavioral health and mental health and wellness providers to what exists out there. Because in studies that ask, there was a 48,000 person study done that was global, and they wanted to understand why people don't seek treatment for their mental health. And they broke it down by country. And in the United States, the number one reason was lack of trust of medical treatment. So people just don't trust the treatment. And I think that has a lot to do with the media. So you can think of movies like One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and examples of things where if you say you're not doing well, that's where you go. So there's some of that, I think, lingering. But the number two reason is that people don't know where to go. They don't know where to start. They don't know what's available. And if you go to Google, not to discredit Google, but if you go search on Google, the answers you're going to find to your questions about where to go are going to be the companies that have the best SEO and the most money for keyword. Like that is like for the AdWord network. And when you go to, let's say that you're the friend of someone who's going through something, your friend tells you, I just got a bipolar diagnosis, and you've never been through it. And you don't know anyone who's ever had that diagnosis. If you go to Google, what you will find is a 2,500 word blog post written by an SEO specialist, probably with stock photos of someone hugging someone else and like Visine tears and these things that are not at all emotionally connectable. It's so hard to connect with them because it doesn't feel like it was created for you. But imagine instead if everyone just knew to go to STIGMA. Because when you went there, not only did you get to see 50 people with bipolar disorder talking about their experience, you got to see people who are the loved ones of those people talking about, this is what it's like to be the partner of someone who lives with bipolar disorder. And here's what we found that works really well. Maybe you'd find resources in that same listing so you can filter by condition. And so ultimately, our big vision is to be the most trusted mental health content destination in the world, because education is the start. There's a tremendous lack of education when it comes to the area of mental health. And I often start with the simplest thing, just the definition of what it means. So many people equate mental health and mental illness. So people will tell me, I don't have mental health. And I say, we all do, just like we all have physical health. And so I think that helping people first and foremost understand that mental health does not equal mental illness. Mental health is something we all have, and sometimes it's strong and sometimes it's weak, and we're all kind of managing it. We have to work on it. That's a really big part of things. But I think the education required is so much bigger than that. But even in the most basic form of what people misunderstand is like the definition of the word itself. Mental health is what it means to be human. It is our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. And I think the sooner people start to realize that, the more the stigma will erase, the more it will go away, and people will understand, oh, we all have this thing and we're all navigating different versions of it, because it could be a disorder, it could be a condition, it could be a lived experience. Your mental health is affected when you lose your job or your spouse or your child. So all of these kinds of things that can be traumatic events in life are going to cause us to struggle a little. And if you knew there was a place you could go to better understand something you'd been through, to instantly find stories of people who have navigated something similar, I think that there is a lot more hope we could create faster. And for those who do want to get some sort of support, because not everyone needs it, not everyone with anxiety, like the majority of people who feel anxiety will never reach the level of having a diagnosable disorder. They might just need some tactics of grounding exercises or learn from other people, like what is a supplement that you take that is helpful for that. So I think, it's a really big world and big opportunity when you think about what mental health is and what people need in the area of mental health.
Yeah. Was it hard when you first had to open up publicly about, your journey or your father's journey or things like that? Like, was that difficult for you?
I will say I want to say no. I'm like, no, it wasn't. But you do something for 2 years and then you're like, I'm good at this and I've always done this. And you forget that, no, you didn't. And I actually just shared a video on LinkedIn talking about how I just couldn't open up about my dad for so long. And I think it's like a couple of things. So there's the difficulty for me and worrying about being judged and what would people think. And I laugh now thinking about how much I didn't talk about it. And now every podcast I'm on, and when I get to do a TV interview, I'm like, let me tell you about my mental illness. And I just couldn't have imagined that world when I was a young person. But a big thing I worried about was my dad, because I love him deeply. And I believe that he feels hurt every time I do this. And I had to navigate, is what I'm doing important enough that it's okay to risk hurting him. And I say hurt him because he does not believe that there is anything wrong with him, because his perception of reality is different. And to paraphrase and quote the doctor that I interviewed in that first thesis project in 2005, she said, the mind of a person with schizophrenia operates in their wakeful life in the way that ours does when we're dreaming. And so when we're dreaming, we can, jump off tall buildings and we can fly and we can be in two places at once. And on some levels, I think what a beautiful existence, to like, if you're safe, which he is because he has loving family, and that's another thing, for another day, but my family in Costa Rica has nurtured and loved him into being the healthiest, best, most productive version of himself that he could ever be. And they never considered putting him anywhere but in their home and loving and taking care of him. But for my dad, he is operating in that dream state in real life. And so the reality that he sees is not the reality that the rest of us have really accepted. Where I get kind of excited, and I don't know enough to speak enough about it, but as you start to look into neurodivergence and the way that neurodivergent people process the world, I look at my son all the time and think, like, how freeing would it be to be him, where he's just in this world where these beautiful things attract his attention and he is happy 98% of the time. He is just singing and smiling, and he is processing the world around him in a different way than I do and than most of the people in his family do. And I get to watch it, and I get to be there and try and encourage him to understand the things that I understand and kind of show him like, hey, this is what we've decided is normal, but normal is not really a thing. And like, who decided anyway that this is the way that social rules should work? And so I'm really inspired by autistic adults that I follow on different social media channels, because I want to understand from their eyes what the world looks like and where are the areas where there, are areas of opportunity for me to nurture River. But I think about it, and in so many ways, I'm like, River was destined to be my son, because I'm paying attention, because I want to create spaces and stories that make people more compassionate and understanding. So like my work every day, even when it's hard, I can actually point to and say, this is going to make, on some level, the world that he grows up in better for him, more understanding of him, more compassionate of him. And so when I think about it that way, I don't worry so much about, my dad being mad, and he still tells me he loves me. So I don't think he's that mad. But it's complicated. And it's just one of those things in life where so often the things that are beautiful, the things that you want to do that are worth doing, don't come without a cost. And so I think, that's kind of where I land on that, but it's not perfect, but it feels really important.
I think leaving the corporate world and entering into entrepreneurship can be tough. I'm curious, how did you deal with that transition, and any advice you have for someone thinking about making a similar transition?
That is hard. I think I, as you can tell, I always resist sort of giving blanket advice, because I'm like, every human is so different, and how am I to know what will be good for them or bad for them? But what I have heard someone say recently about entrepreneurship is, again, paraphrasing, I'm going to butcher this one more than any of the other ones, but was something to the effect of, being an entrepreneur is about learning about yourself. And I think what is so true about that is that when you are working for someone else, even if you're there from the earliest days, and I was for some of the startups, or even if you're in a giant corporate machine where you feel like a cog in the wheel, and I was right before I started STIGMA, there's always someone else who's kind of making these enormous decisions. And even if you're in a very high position, there's some seniority and some people who are guiding the ship, so to speak. And one of the things that entrepreneurship teaches you is just the ultimate accountability, because even if you have team members, at the end of the day, you and your co-founder or co-founders are the ones making decisions that will make or break the thing. And you're forced to do so many things that you don't like and are bad at. So I, avoided being a doctor and going to med school, so I didn't have to do the things I was bad at. And now I make financial models. And I will say that there are areas where, as an artist, I struggle more than others. But what you learn about yourself is really what you're capable of, and how much you care about what you're doing. And you hear that said all the time, like, do not start a business as an entrepreneur if you don't love what you do. And you hear it and you're like, okay. And then people will point to the very few small percentage of people who are successful in entrepreneurship, which is why some people do it for the money and the unicorn status and whatever. And they will point to people with technology solutions that maybe aren't the most exciting, but then earned a lot of money. And I think that what is missing in those equations is that it might not be exciting to you what they're building, that technology solution, because it's not who you are. You think that's boring, but they didn't think it's boring, because I actually don't believe you can be a successful entrepreneur, and define success how you will, but let's say financially successful without being passionate about the problem you're solving. And the way you solve it, you might not be passionate about, but the problem is usually something you deeply care about. Because I don't think you could do it if you weren't, because it is the cliche of all cliches, but there's so many days that you want to give up and you're like, can I do this? On Sunday, I had this good self-care day, which I never do. And I was like, I'm going to try and invest in myself. And I got workouts in and I had my green smoothie and I read poetry and I was on it. I was like taking care of me today. And I had the best day. And I woke up Monday and I was like, I don't know what, Monday being yesterday, I don't know what we're doing. I don't know if I'm the person for this. And I am really open with my team. And I told them everything I was feeling. They're like, call it a day now. Like there's like an hour left in the day, just like call it a day, go for a walk. And we have that kind of mentality. Like at STIGMA, we have mental health channels and we have people who we do asks for hope on our Slack. We have a mandatory mental health day once a month. So once a month, you have to take a full day off of work, 12 days a year, and you have to share one thing you did for yourself that was nice. And it's not to prove that it was a mental health day. It's for the accountability of saying, I slept in and that's it. Or I had a green smoothie, or I read some poetry, or whatever it is. And so I think, those kinds of things are helpful if you're an entrepreneur and you can weave them in. Like, how will you take care of your mental health? And I'll say one more thing. I know I kind of went long on this one, but it's important. I had a West Coast investor once say to me, hey, you said you have anxiety at the top of this call and being an entrepreneur is really hard. Are you sure you can do it? And I remember thinking what he could have said, rephrased, and a very welcome question would have been, it's wonderful that you have lived experience that helps you understand the problem. How have you thought about taking care of your mental health during the stressful times of being an entrepreneur? And how will you take care of the mental health of your employees? That question I would have left because I have answers and I had plans in mind for what we would do. But I think that being an entrepreneur is absolutely the hardest and the most rewarding thing I have ever done. I would do it over again 100 times out of 100. So if you're someone who's thinking about being an entrepreneur and you're scared to take the leap, but you have this thing inside you where you're like, this really needs to exist. I really need to do this. The world really needs this. And that feeling keeps coming. Do it. Because what will happen is you will learn so much about yourself and you will most likely be a more marketable professional no matter what, even if you are one of the 90% who fails. So go into it knowing you will probably fail. But if you have it in your heart to do it, and if you love the problem or care deeply about the problem, I think it's totally worth doing. And there's nothing I could say that could prepare you for the change, because where you came from is different than where I came from professionally. Who you are is different than who I am. And what you're trying to build is different on both sides. So it's really just about being ready for the challenge, knowing that it's going to be incredibly difficult, but also being really excited because it is the best thing I've ever done professionally.
Yeah. I am curious, do you want to talk about any other, like, what's the best way for people to support the app? Or I know you do mental health pop-ups and stuff like that. What's the best way to be involved with STIGMA app and kind of help the mission?
Yeah, thank you for asking. I'll keep it simple and give you one thing. The app is available on Google Play and the App Store, and it's totally free. If you search the STIGMA app, it's the easiest way to find it. STIGMA was taken, so we couldn't just be STIGMA. But if you search the STIGMA app in Google Play or the App Store and download the app for free, what I would ask you to do is go offer hope to someone. It feels fantastic. We have a vision of a future where people make offering hope to a stranger in need as common a daily mental health practice as meditation or journaling. It is proven that research shows that if you regularly engage in altruistic behavior, it improves your mental health and your physical health. And so what I would ask of anyone who is interested for yourself, interested for a loved one, or just appreciated my story and is like, I want to help this person, I would really appreciate people just going and downloading the app and offering hope to someone. While you're there, you can see some of the stories. So maybe there's something that someone in your life who you care about is navigating, and you can watch a story and share it with them because it might make them feel seen. Or it's a great conversation starter to have someone else to react to. We're getting into licensing content and sharing stories as like compassionate conversation starters, because it can be hard to talk about what we're going through. But if we have someone's story who we can say, when she said that, I really felt like and talk about it sort of in a third person scenario, it is a bit of a gateway, an entry point into talking about things that otherwise could be harder to do. And so I think there's so many things you can do in the app when you're there, but because it's free and because, we only launched the app 75 days ago. So it's still really new. It helps us to have signups. It helps us to get feedback. So sign up, offer hope, and then tell us what could be better. We know that there is a lot. It's an MVP. So, but we want to hear it. And the more, votes we get for things that people want, the more we can make it everything that people need.
Yeah. Well, I just want to thank you and acknowledge you as I really appreciate you being so open, and obviously love the mission of what you're trying to do and what you're trying to be, and hopefully, the main thing I think with all of these solutions is it's making people's lives better, uh, and that's, as you talked about, a range of different things for people in terms of how they take care of themselves, but hopefully this can be as an aspect of how people better themselves. So all the best in your journey, and thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
If people want to support you, is there a good way to do that?
Well, if you're watching this and you are an investor, we will be starting to fundraise soon. We are in the Chicago 2022, the JP Morgan cohort of Techstars. So we are mid-program. So I had a busy Techstars day today, and I was excited to come do this podcast. You can find me on LinkedIn or email me at ariana@thestigma.app. But if you have interest, if you are an early stage investor and you want to invest in this space of media and mental health and wellness, I'd love to speak to you.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thank you.